we are fiddling while Rome burns if the world is at war?
I think it's very serious, and it has escalated regionally, and the prospects for further escalation are there. The Iranian attack on Israel raises the bar very high, in my view. And Iran has been a malign actor for a long time in the Middle East, supporting its proxies in terms of Hamas and Hezbollah. And we've had the horrific Hamas attack in October the 7th last year, followed by, in my view, disproportionate and excessive attack on Gaza, with horrific consequences for the civilian population of Gaza, and women, children, and innocent people being killed, and the entire sort of way of life there destroyed, to such an extent that the UN are saying the population are on the verge of famine. Now we're in Lebanon with 1 million people displaced. And what I feel in terms of the overall situation is the lack of any strategic sense of where all of this is going. And ultimately there has to be a political pathway developed. There has to be a peace pathway developed, because ultimately all of the people living in the Middle East have to live in harmony alongside of each other. There's no other way.
We're all trying to figure out what really is going on. I mean, the activities of Israel are such that there was bound to be a retaliation from Tehran at some point. I mean, don't forget, they actually sent a missile into Tehran themselves in July. So they have attacked Iranian sovereign territory. So you wonder, is this part of the game plan? Is this what you contemplate? Is this Netanyahu just looking for the excuse to raise the stakes and maybe go after Tehran's nuclear capabilities?
Some analysts are saying that this that from an Israel military perspective, that this may present an opportunity.
Yeah.
In terms of dealing with Hezbollah, dealing with Hamas, and dealing with Iran. But I think that's a high-risk strategy in my view, but also has devastating consequences for ordinary people living in the region. And when I was at United Nations the week before last, I was struck by the real sort of worry and concern amongst the Egyptians and the Jordanians in terms of the impact of this on their populations, the actual real prospect of instability in the region spreading far and wide in their own countries. They're now looking at a prospect of mass exodus of Palestinians into their territories, which they do not agree.
They've had a détente with Israel for decades now, both Jordan and Egypt. They may be asked by others in the region, make up your mind, whose side are you on?
Well, that's the pressure they are now under. Remember the large Palestinian population in Jordan, and the government is coming under pressure. They're tearing their hair out in some respects at 30 years of peace, and as you said, détente, and relations had improved immeasurably between Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, and they feel there's almost a reckless sort of lack of any consideration of the implications of all of this escalation of conflict and war, and particularly in terms of the impact on their own societies and countries, but on the wider region more generally. And then that, of course, impacts globally, because trade in the Red Sea is below 50% now of what it was. So we're not all immune.
The longer
from this.
journey means higher prices,
higher costs and higher prices.
For everybody. Meantime, we have our own particular small part to play in all of this, because we have our peacekeepers in UNIFIL who are literally on the front line of those Israeli incursions into southern Lebanon.
Absolutely, and that is a big worry and concern. Although our troops are safe, they're professional, they work with thousands of others in UNIFIL, and I've had talks with varying European Union contributing countries, Spain and France in particular, United Kingdom as well, in terms of our civilians within Lebanon, Irish citizens in Lebanon, but more generally in terms of the UNIFIL troops. I mean, I met in the United Nations with Jean-Pierre Lacroix, who's the Under Secretary for Peacekeeping, to go through all the various scenarios. Our troops are safe where they are right now, and probably safer there than in terms of moving about Lebanon at this stage, given the volatility and level of activity that's going on in terms of bombing and so on like that. Spoke to the Chief of Staff this morning. They're safe, they're well, they bunkered down last evening. They are the eyes and ears of the international community now in terms of Lebanon. We've seen in past conflicts, if there's any unilateral sudden exodus of peacekeepers from any given region, it can lead to even worse atrocities and so forth.
Well, Hezbollah are probably somewhat rudderless after the decimation of the leadership, but still, they've more or less said to the Israelis, come into our parlour if you wish, at your peril.
They have, and one. I mean, I'm not a military expert or analyst, but certainly the Hezbollah command structure has been decimated in the last while. But my overall concern is where is it all leading? And the level of hate that has been stoked up in the region is something that will last a long time. I mean, what has happened in Gaza is not something that can be picked up very quickly afterwards and put together again. So there's going to be a very lingering, bitter legacy of hate and division in the region. And that will probably stoke up more radicalized opinion in the region. So I don't see where ultimate security comes from through the waging of war. And I think the war has to stop. I think the hostages have to be released. And I think that an enormous effort now must go into de-escalating the entire situation.
But is that possible if we don't really understand Netanyahu's game plan? And in terms of our forces in UNIFIL, I mean, Israel has shown itself in Gaza, if you want to use the metaphor, the UN as the blue helmets or the blue berets, whatever it might be. No, Israel is not a respecter of that, even though they will quote a UN resolution which allows them to try to sanitize that area south of the Litani River.
I think there is, in terms of UNIFIL generally, I think Israel military would be conscious of the role of UNIFIL, and I think would respect the role of UNIFIL.
You hope?
In terms, I believe they would, in terms of how they conduct whatever their operations they conduct. And UNIFIL have been in constant contact with the IDF and indeed with Hezbollah and other actors to respect the role of peacekeepers more generally. And so far that is held in terms of...
even the term you use there, we all use it, peacekeepers. And you're looking at the region, there's no peace there. And so what peace are they keeping?
But it's the level, I mean, yeah, correct. I mean, the situation is now... Is in terms of is a full blown escalated situation. Well, it's not a full blown on ground war yet. There has been incursions, somewhat limited in real terms. It's very significant and horrific bombing of Lebanon. 2,000-pound bombs landing in densely populated areas. But the peace, I mean, the peacekeepers were there. I think they were a significant deterrent to conflagration and so on like that, and the worsening of the situation. But it has been an imperfect peace. And Hezbollah had significant strength and dominance in the south of Lebanon. We have no government in Lebanon. We have a caretaker government. We have a collapsed economy. The people of Lebanon cannot take a war of any consequence.
But it'll be imposed upon them, perhaps.
It's been imposed right now on them with I think, horrific consequences for them.
Now, you were in the UN, and it strikes us, looking at the UN now, it appears, because of the structure of the Security Council, that it's fairly toothless. I mean, Russia's got the veto in terms of any possible progress on Ukraine, and America has the veto in terms of any possible sanction or censure of Israel.
The Security Council is paralysed and has been for most of the while in respect of not just the Middle East but other conflicts. There was a breakthrough, I think, in terms of the resolution in relation to a peace formula for Gaza, which neither Hamas or Israel have taken up. But it is, largely speaking, paralysed. It needs urgent reform. It's past its sell-by date in respect of a post-World War II structure,
but the
which
idea
bears no relationship to the
of the permanent
world
members
of
having
today.
Vetoes on anything. And
yes.
Okay, the General Assembly can pass a motion, but so what?
And that's why I've been I will be bringing forward amendments to the triple lock, because the idea that Ireland's participation in peacekeeping missions in the future would depend on a Security Council that now has the exercise of the veto as the first response, as opposed to something that should be a last resort.
Do we have a plan to extricate our troops, if necessary, if all-out war breaks out and there's no role anymore?
We have planned various scenarios with troop contributing countries. And we go through all scenarios, and UNIFIL at the senior command, and that's why I went to UN headquarters last week to exactly focus on that specific issue. But for now, the clear preference of all of the countries who are contributing is to stay put, to commit to peacekeeping in Lebanon, because various scenarios can unfold. We might get a de-escalation yet. I mean, we should not give up hope. The international community has to do everything it possibly can to leverage and to try and create pressure to get all actors to de-escalate as quickly as possible. I do know the United States are putting a lot of pressure on to try and get de-escalation. The European Union is likewise behind the scenes. And that will have to continue because there is no future, in my view. There are short-term gains to be had, maybe, for some of the actors might think there are short-term gains to be had from military engagement, but long-term, the people will be the loser.
When you look at the map of the Middle East, I invite any of our listeners to Google a map of the Middle East, and you're imagining there's the mighty Israel and the timorous opponents, but then you look at the size and the populations. Israel is tiny. Absolutely. What it has is a nuclear arsenal and a huge military backup from the United States. But it's in a powerless position. And the idea that that tiny little area of the Middle East could literally control the whole area, it just beggars belief.
You see, that's how I've always analysed it as well. I mean, which is the point I'm making in terms of ultimate long-term security that depends on good relationships with your neighbours. And like Iran has been behaving in a malign manner for many years in endeavouring to undermine Israel. That has to be said as well. And let's be clear-eyed about that. And in terms of the use of Hezbollah and in terms of the use of Hamas, both of whom have held back good governance, respectively, in Lebanon and in Gaza.
I mean, the money that is spent on armaments and armies might be better spent on improving the lot of the civilian population.
Correct, 100%. And that was what was, I mean, in terms of the normalization of relationships and the development of good relations between Egypt, Jordan and Israel, or at least working relationships between them, all that now is at risk. And I think your basic point is correct. I don't think a military solution long-term will cut it alone. And yes, Israel has technological and military superiority, but ultimately one can't have total security or peace and going about your lives without really sorting out your nearest neighbours and those who live amongst you. And that's why I can never understand the strategic sort of approach of Israel in respect to the Palestinian population. I don't believe it's possible if that's what the Israel views. And I've asked Israel straight up, and so has Ayman Safadi and others in the Arab Peace Initiative, what is your strategic agenda in the end of the day? How are you going to deal with millions of Palestinians who live in the West Bank and in Gaza? Do you really think you can expel them all into Jordan or across the Rafah border into Egypt? You can't. That's not feasible. And so you need to look at how you give or deal with self-determination for Palestinians, but also work out the structures that would enable Palestinians, future generations of Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace and in close neighbourliness. That's the only way. We've learned that in Northern Ireland ourselves. It's not as complex as maybe the Middle East politics is, but a lot of the principles around the Northern Ireland peace process do apply in terms of parity of esteem, dual citizenship, all sorts of initiatives, and it needs fresh thinking